have Professor William Bruce from UC Berkeley for delivering this distinguished lecture. On behalf of IITM and IMSP, I request Dr. R. Krishnan, Honorable Director IITM, to welcome Professor Bruce with a bouquet to the Institute. Meanwhile, I will give you just a brief introduction about our speaker. Professor Bruce is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on large-scale climate dynamics, aiming to understand how atmospheric circulation, ocean interaction, radiative transfer, and land surface processes control regional and global climate. He is especially well known for his research on monsoons. He completed his master's from MIT in 2002 and pursued for his PhD there under the guidance of renowned Professor Karim Emanuel, and completed his PhD in 2008. Later he joined Harvard University as a postdoctoral fellow. He then joined Yale University as an assistant professor, and currently he is an associate professor at UC Berkeley. He has published numerous papers on climate dynamics and gained particular recognition in the monsoon research community after his influential paper in Nature, which discussed the role of orographic influence versus plateau heating in controlling the South Asian monsoon. This was followed by several papers on the thermal and mechanical influences of the Tibetan plateau, which was happened in early 2010s. And around 2015, he began to publish a series of papers examining the monsoon low pressure system, their dynamics, and potential climate change impacts. I was also fortunate to co-author with a paper with him, which was published in PNAS. In addition to monsoon research, he has published several papers covering the broad topic of large-scale climate dynamics, extremes, and its long-term changes. He served as an editor for Journal of Climate and GRL, and has received several prestigious awards, including James R. Horton Award, and additionally, he is a faculty scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. As he described his research approach in his profile, in all of their works, they combine theory, observational analysis, and numerical models to discover how the world around us works. So this unique perspective makes him an exceptional scholar, and we are truly honored to welcome him for delivering this joint IITM and IMSP distinguished lecture. Welcome, Professor Bruce. The stage is all yours. Yeah, please.
What I believe you all know are very high impact storms at the edge of our tropics. I phrase it that way because I think monsoon depressions are the regional manifestation of a large variety of transient propagating atmospheric vortices off the equator that produce precipitation extremes on Earth. This is work that's been done with quite a few people, including postdocs, several postdocs, and even an undergraduate in my group at University of California, Berkeley, together with some collaborators at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab who were very important in helping us have the computational infrastructure that we needed for doing some of this work. So I want to begin by showing you this animation of winds about 1.5 kilometers above Earth's surface. And you can see here over this region of northern India what is something that is at the beginning stages of becoming a monsoon depression. You can see the flow has this sort of cyclonic or counterclockwise curvature. And these are fast winds in the low-level monsoon eastward jet. I've actually converted it here from our typical meter per second just to give you a little bit more of an intuition for, yes, 60 kilometers per hour is quite a fast wind speed. And you'll note here, this will come up later, that the wind speed changes from that 60 kilometers per hour down to 0 over, on continental scales, a fairly short distance. I'm going to zoom in on the next slide, though, on this particular box to show you now the same wind field, but just one day later. And you can see that now the storm is really, does have a full vortical structure. The wind is more going around in a circle or an ellipse. One thing I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that these storms are heavily precipitating. And the peak precipitation is not in the center of the vortex, which would be about here, but it's to the southwest of the vortex. And the peak rain rate for this one particular storm, a little over a year ago, exceeded 30 centimeters in a single day. So this is a classic monsoon low pressure system. About 10 to 15 of these form each summer over the broader Indian, Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea region. And these produce catastrophic floods. I think one disaster that is still very prevalent in, I believe, the collective memory of many people here in India are the Uttarakhand floods. It happened a little over a decade ago now, when over 6,000 people died. This is an image of Kedarnath, where the permanent resident population may be quite low, but there are hundreds of thousands, at least, people who visit this region as tourists every year. The Pakistan floods in 2010, about 2,000 people died. I think this imagery of the Indus River, which you can see here, is quite remarkable. You can see before the flood and then after the flood, the large expansion of the Indus River. Flooding in Pakistan submerged roughly 20% of the surface area of the country. So enormous flood. And this, together with the Uttarakhand floods and many other floods, were associated with, were essentially caused by the rainfall associated with a monsoon low pressure system. In work out of my group, we took low pressure system tracks over the observational record going back around 40 years or so, and we asked whether each human disaster, so that we took a disaster data set that contained number of people killed, other human impacts associated with particular types of disasters. We looked at just the hydrological disasters, and we asked what fraction of those occurred when a monsoon low pressure system passed over the region. And over large parts of India, especially this core monsoon zone, you had 80 to 90% of the disasters being attributable in that sense to these monsoon low pressure systems. Now, I want to transition into a little bit into the dynamics that I'm going to tell you about by reminding you that these transient vortices are embedded within the continental scale monsoon system. And so I'm showing you here the northern hemisphere summer and the southern hemisphere summer precipitation climatologies. And you see that if I outline what I think most people would agree are the 6 main monsoon regions of the planet, the South Asian monsoon is by far the strongest, largest, and most poleward located monsoon region. Each of these 6 monsoon regions is wet in the local summer, but then dry in the local winter. And switching that winter plot with a schematic of the thermally direct monsoon overturning circulation. This shows what I think many people would write down, shows what many people would write down as one of the simplest schematics of a monsoon circulation. This would be northern hemisphere summer, where the Earth is receiving more shortwave in the summer hemisphere. And so you have warm air rising, cooling as it condenses, water falling out as water, liquid water falling out as rain in that rising branch of that thermally direct overturning circulation and cross-equatorial flow. And so as I proceed through my talk, think about the fact that these monsoon low pressure systems are, remember the one that I drew you earlier, the one that we showed you earlier, and I was drawing these vortical circulations. Those vortices would be about this size, right? Those are embedded within a much larger scale interhemispheric circulation. Now, the main science question that I'm going to ask today is what causes monsoon depressions and how are they changing over time? I'm going to begin by talking about prior knowledge, and then I'm going to tell you more about my work on two topics, mechanisms of storm intensification, as well as past and future trends. And I'm going to conclude, that's not on the outline here, but I'm going to take one of the products of our work on the dynamics, a tracking algorithm, and apply that to forecasts and tell you about an operational system that we have going now to forecast these storms. All right, this is what monsoon depressions look like. They are cold core cyclonic vortices that sometimes form over land. And those two bold statements are meant to indicate ways in which these are distinct from classical tropical cyclones, meaning these are different from typhoons and hurricanes, which are warm core and form only over ocean. And as soon as typhoons or hurricanes make landfall, they decrease exponentially in their intensity. All right, monsoon depressions, this is a latitude versus height composite of the eastward wind shown in contours. So we have, using the classic physics notation of this is wind coming out of the page and wind going into the page. So we have a circulation kind of moving like this around the vortex center. Below the peak winds, you have a cold core, and then in the upper troposphere it's warm. But when we say cold core, we mean it's cold in the lower troposphere. A typhoon or a hurricane would be warm all the way down to the surface. If we look at a composite, the same composite, but we look now at the precipitation field, longitude versus latitude about the composite mean storm center. So the circulation here, the storm circulation would be going like this. You can see that the precipitation is also biased or concentrated in the southwest quadrant of this storm. Intense precipitation in the composite mean, things often get smeared out by quite a bit in composites, but you can see here you're getting about 6 centimeters a day peak rainfall, even with all that smoothing of the averaging you're doing. Remember the storm I showed you earlier was dumping, that animation at the very beginning was dumping 30 centimeters. That would be 300 millimeters a day. So this is what a monsoon depression looks like. Where do monsoon depressions occur? Well, they are part of the global population of transient, low-level atmospheric vortices. And what I'm showing you plots of here are the track density, this shading, and the genesis density, meaning the number of storms forming per horizontal unit area, as the black contours. And this is all transient atmospheric vortices. So this includes hurricanes, typhoons, African easterly waves. What I think is compelling is when you look at the distribution of Atlantic hurricanes, they're actually so diffuse that outside of this main development region, they don't even show up on this contour level. And the distribution of monsoon low pressure systems is so concentrated in space and time that it is actually the global maximum of tropical cyclogenesis and tropical vortex track density. I'm going to focus on this region in the rest of my talk. I think people here, you live in India, you're interested in this because you live here, but I think it's always important to bear in mind that this is a global maximum. If you're studying global phenomena, this is a very interesting region. And if you want, for instance, a nice natural laboratory where just again and again and again, the same small region, 10 to 15 times a summer, you have vortex genesis happening, you couldn't ask for a better natural laboratory than this northwest corner of the Bay of Bengal. Okay, so I talked to you about what monsoon depressions look like, where do they form. Now I want to say, what are they? You know, how do we understand these things? What mechanistically causes them to form and amplify? Well, past theories for their genesis and amplification can be roughly divided into 3 categories. And you can see from the names here that quite a few scientists in India were very influential over the decades in the theory for how these storms form. I want to divide these up into these 3 categories, and note that these 2 right here are what I would classify as just some kind of hydrodynamic instability. And if you're familiar with barotropic instability and baroclinic instability, that's great. You don't have to be. The 3rd category is tropical cyclone dynamics, just kind of generically, people viewing these as tropical cyclones that are trying to spin up into typhoons, but that are prevented from doing so by some mechanism. I want to show you an example now of hydrodynamic instability. This is a numerical simulation of barotropic instability in particular, which will, kind of giving away one of the main points of my talk, be the mechanism that I will argue is relevant for monsoon depressions. And so I'm essentially going to be arguing that some of the scientists who worked in this category are correct. But some years later, and I hope you'll agree with a lot more data and numerical models that were not available to use back in the late 1960s and 1970s and even early 1980s. Okay, so this example of barotropic instability, we have an initial flow state, and this could be air, this could be water, but if you have longitude in this direction and latitude in this direction, think that you're looking down at a map of the planet. You have westward flow and eastward flow, and there's some strip of dye in the middle of the fluid. If we animate this then, initially the perturbations are so small, you can't see them and it looks like nothing happens. But then those perturbations grow exponentially over time. And the dye strip spins up into vortices, or is captured by these vortices, and the vortices eventually merge. The flow becomes more complicated and extremely nonlinear. But the process of barotropic instability is what takes you from that initial wavy flow, or amplifies the initial wavy flow and turns you and allows you to turn into vortices. Now, the hypothetically hydrodynamically unstable flow that I'm talking about is the east-west wind of the continental scale monsoon circulation. So I'm coming back to this schematic that I showed you before of this thermally direct overturning circulation. This is essentially the cross-equatorial Hadley cell of the monsoon circulation. But because we are on a rotating planet, the trade winds, this is your notation meant to represent an arrow going into the board. You're seeing the tail of the arrow, and here you're seeing the very tip of the arrow coming out of the board, the arrow directed in the same direction as the wind. So these are your trade winds in the winter hemisphere or in the upper troposphere. Maybe we don't call the upper troposphere trade winds, but nevertheless, westward flow. At low levels in the summer hemisphere, the trade winds are reversed to become the low-level monsoon westerlies, or eastward flow. And we have strong horizontal shear, or gradients in wind speed, and we also have strong vertical shear. And the vertical shear is what's associated with baroclinic instability, and the horizontal shear is what's associated with barotropic instability. In exploring those possible instabilities, past theoretical work was often very idealized. I think it's good to be idealized when you do some initial calculations. But this led to, over the decades, often conflicting claims. This is an example from a stability analysis that was done by Linzen and co-authors in 1983. And they said, let's take the upper tropospheric wind at 200 hectopascals and let's approximate it as these 2 straight lines that are connected. connected. So we have the upper level easterlies, zonal flow is negative 18 meters per second, and then it becomes westerlies as you go into the extratropics at 40 degrees north. And they said the mid-tropospheric flow has this sort of profile over the monsoon region. And then they just assessed the stability of these different flows at these two different levels. They came up with comments like this. The Linzen et al. Paper, which I just showed you their theoretical profiles, they said the local barotropically unstable response in the Bay of Bengal will be dominated by what they called the lower troposphere at 500 hectopascals. That contradicts an earlier paper that said neither barotropic nor baroclinic instability can explain the observed features of monsoon depressions. Disagreeing with both of those papers, 10 years later, a paper said the main growth mechanism of monsoon low pressure systems is by large baroclinic energy conversion. All right, so you can find this is kind of what puzzled me and led me to work on this topic, as I felt like reading the literature, I could not understand fundamentally what caused these systems to form and amplify. I also wanted to give you this perspective. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a Google Ngram. A Google Ngram just plots the occurrence frequency of a word or a phrase in all of the books indexed by Google. And so you can see that if you look at this green line, climate change was really not written about much before the year 1970, hardly at all, and then started to become more popular, and the frequency with which we talk about climate change has really taken off over the last 30 years or so. Hurricanes, we've kind of been writing about those with some variability, but about at the same rate over the past century or so. Monsoon depressions, I thought this was interesting in part because it confirmed my own impression of the literature, which is that there was a lot of work on the dynamics of these storms in the late 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s, and then it kind of died off a little bit. Not to say that there wasn't work being done, but it was just much less than it was in the 1980s. So it seemed a good time, given that we have had a lot of advances in the availability of high-resolution data, the reliability, robustness of that data, and our ability to use very high-resolution numerical models, so-called cloud-resolving models, to try to explore some of these questions, test some of these previous theories for amplification mechanisms, and see which one works. Do any of them work? And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about now, is mechanisms of storm intensification. And we did this by examining the stability of the monsoon circulation using modern atmospheric state estimates, or what we call reanalyses. So we took the atmospheric state over South Asia. This is the main development region for monsoon depressions. And I'm showing you here the wind, the vector wind shown in arrows, and the zonal wind shaded, just so you can see the low-level westerlies and the region where the westerly jet goes to zero and then becomes this weak easterly jet just along the southern edge of the Tibetan Plateau. We took the wind from reanalyses for about 100 monsoon depressions, and we composited it about 2 days before the monsoon depression formed. So this would be the state that was unstable to the formation of a monsoon depression. We observed this state right before monsoon depressions formed. If you take a vertical section of that state along this green line, you see as a function of latitude versus height, if we plot the absolute vorticity, you see that the absolute vorticity has a maximum right here. And one of the classic criteria for a fluid to be barotropically unstable is that you have to have some kind of interior maximum of absolute vorticity. And so you see in this region right here, over India, essentially, there is a maximum of barotropic, there is a maximum of absolute vorticity right before the monsoon depressions spin up. This is the Tibetan Plateau. You can kind of ignore this data here. That's just the European Center in their reanalyses often extrapolates data below the surface. Now what we did in order to assess the stability is we used a high resolution atmospheric model, a so-called convection permitting or cloud resolving model. And we imposed that basic state, and then we looked for the most rapidly growing anomalies. We did that. These are the only equations in my talk today. They are meant just to illustrate for you how we did this. We took an example. This is the example. This is an example of two of the conservation equations from our model. This is the momentum equation, and this is the thermodynamic equation. The point is that we imposed source terms on the right-hand side of these equations, on every conservation equation in the model, and these source terms maintain the basic state. The basic state is exactly this state right here, this state right here. So this state is being maintained by these source terms that we put into the model. And then the monsoon depressions or lows, if that state is unstable, they'll be spinning up just spontaneously out of the model. Now, by spinning up spontaneously, what I mean is we're going to look we're not just going to run the model with an initial condition, but we're going to look in a little bit more of a systematic sense at the basic state and at processes in the model to see if we can understand if these things spin up, if they amplify, why are they doing so? So I'm going to show you a series of calculations. One is with a basic state that doesn't vary in longitude. One is with a three-dimensional basic state. And those are both going to be calculations that are done dry, without precipitation. And we're also going to do linear dynamics. We're going to look for linear instabilities. We're not going to allow complicated nonlinearities in the flow. And then, only then, we're going to go to nonlinear, we're going to look at a three-dimensional basic state with nonlinear dynamics, and we're going to allow water vapor to condense. So first, I'm going to show you the result from when we consider the amplification rate of anomalies for a longitudinally invariant basic state. So again, here's our basic state. 2 days before a monsoon depression spins up, the atmosphere looks like this. We're taking just the wind, the temperature, the pressure distribution at this longitude, and we're imposing it at every longitude as a function of latitude and height. And then we are looking for the disturbances that grow and asking what is their wavelength and do they look similar to observed monsoon depressions. So this is a linear stability analysis, or essentially more mathematically what we're doing is we're calculating, we're looking for the eigenmodes of the system. So as a function of wavelength, we're looking at growth rates. And the two lines to look at here are the total. Well, the first line to look at here is the total. The next line I want you to look at is the one that is the biggest, and that's this orange line here. So the total growth rate is positive only for disturbances that have a wavelength larger than about 1.1 or 1.2 kilometers. This means that vortices that are only 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers in horizontal size, they would not amplify in that basic state. The vortices have to, or the waves, have to become larger than about 1.1 thousand kilometers in order to be unstable and grow. And the disturbances that amplify most rapidly have a horizontal wavelength of around 5,000 kilometers. So think of the vortex, the cyclonic part of the flow, being about half that wavelength. The anticyclonic part would be the other half. So this would be a vortex that is around 2,500 kilometers in diameter. That actually matches monsoon depression size decently well. Now let's talk about the other lines on this plot, because this sort of linear stability analysis, what it allows you to do is it allows you to break down the amplification process into the terms or the physical processes that are contributing to amplification. Let's look at friction, for example, the brown line. You can see that friction tends to slow things down, right? You put a block on the stage, you slide it, it'll tend to slow down over time if you don't keep pushing on it. Friction produces a negative growth rate, so it's counteracting whatever positive growth rates are and taking the total more toward a negative value. Most processes, pressure work, diffusion, some fairly small residual in our analysis, and this green term here, U prime, W prime term, those are all negative. The only large positive term, especially in the most unstable wavelengths, is this U prime, V prime, du bar dy term. That's the mathematical notation for barotropic growth, and these math terms just represent anomalies of velocity or anomalies of momentum being fluxed from, being transferred from the energy of the mean eastward jet into small scale vortices. So basically what that orange line represents is energy going from this mean smooth eastward flow into flow of the perturbations. Okay, we can see that that dominates here at some particular vertical level. All right, now these, yes? Correct. This is a 4-kilometer horizontal resolution model.
And the friction is
The friction, no, there is diffusion in the model, but this is boundary layer friction. Yeah. So this is friction with the surface of the Earth. Yeah. So it doesn't operate, in the free troposphere. So yes, again, this is a cloud resolving model, but there's no moisture, and we're just looking at we're actually doing a calculation with the cloud resolving model of the linear growth rates. Okay, so this is sort of a linear stability analysis conducted numerically with a cloud resolving model. We could just run the cloud resolving model and see what happens, but then all we get is that a monsoon depression grows. And it doesn't tell us anything about the processes that allow it to spin up, which is what we could do here. Yes, well, this is a linear stability analysis. So there will be linear advection, but not nonlinear advection. Okay. These anomalies have a 3-dimensional structure, and it looks like this as a function of longitude versus height. The color shading shows the northward wind, and the black contours show temperature. So what you see here is the black contours are dashed, they're negative, there's a cold anomaly beneath a warm anomaly, and you see that there's this vertical flow like that with northward flow here, southward flow here. Okay, so this actually looks somewhat like an observed monsoon depression in that the peak winds are around 3 kilometers altitude, and there's a cold core below the peak winds. Interesting, because there's no water condensation or evaporation, and so we're getting the low-level cold core purely from the dry dynamics and the instability. You don't need to invoke evaporation of rain or anything like that. You can see the vortex that I sketched below here in yellow up here. This is the plan view longitude versus latitude, and you can see that by virtue of this being a linear stability analysis, this structure has to just repeat itself out to infinity. But you can see sort of this cyclonic phase of the wave that's amplifying looks somewhat, it has the right scale as a monsoon depression would. Now, I want to point out that past work, this is the level used in that barotropic stability analysis in that 1983 paper. So our argument is that they were looking at the wrong level in the free troposphere, and the real instability is much, much lower down. But now I want to raise a point that the region that is barotropically unstable is only about 1,500 kilometers wide. So here's India again, and this is the region right here that is unstable. So this is around 1,500 kilometers wide, but remember that the disturbance that was growing, is wavelength or horizontal scale 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers. So if something is 4,000 kilometers across, but it can only amplify, there's the region of the atmosphere that amplifies it is only 1,500 kilometers wide, and the whole thing is propagating westward, then it's only going to get amplified for a little bit, and then it's going to pass out of the domain and decay. So this is kind of problematic in terms of stability analyses, is that you want the region that's unstable to be larger than the wavelength of the thing that's growing, otherwise you won't be able to maintain the growth. So that motivated looking not just at one particular longitude, but looking in 3 dimensions, taking a basic state that varies in longitude, and then asking the question, what do the disturbances that grow just due to the dry dynamics out of that basic state look like? And this is a life cycle of the instability. So we're looking here at day 0, day 2, day 4. As you move down and then down again, these are snapshots of the disturbance that grows in the observed basic state. And so you can see this would be your thing that is going to become a monsoon depression, starting to amplify, getting stronger, reaching peak intensity, continuing to propagate across northern India, and then slowly decaying. So this comes out of purely dry dynamics of the numerical model. It's actually, note that here I use the terminology least stable. This anomaly does not grow spontaneously. It is actually slightly stable, it's not unstable. And so when you have a 3-dimensional basic state, the world we live in is 3-dimensional, monsoon depressions will not grow just due to the dry dynamics alone. They need some help from water condensation. Nevertheless, though, even though these aren't amplifying on their own, their vertical structure looks very much like observed monsoon depressions. Longitude versus height. Here's the wind field of this linear amplifying mode. You see this cold anomaly here in the lower troposphere. Black contours are temperature again. And this vertical structure looks remarkably similar to that of observed monsoon depressions. The third thing that I told you I was going to do is, yes? Oh, the horizontal scale of these. Yeah, it's going from about 80 to, with a 3D basic state, it gets a little bit smaller. What the similarity of this result to Monkey Mac's result is, I don't think I can answer that for you right now. I'd have to look back. Yeah. Did he? So he did a linear stability analysis with the zonally varying basis state. Okay, I don't remember. Yeah, but I'm happy to look that up and get back to you. Yeah, we probably, we spent quite a bit of time when we were writing these papers. Michael Diaz was a great postdoc who did a lot of, led a lot of this work, and we did review in detail a lot of these older papers. And I think, like I said before, some of them certainly had a lot of insight, and my argument was that essentially some of these could be right, and we were essentially setting out to see with modern data sets and high resolution models, were any of these right? And I think what we're doing is arguing that barotropic instability was right. Now, Mach in 1983 concluded that baroclinic instability, if that's the paper you're talking about.
Yeah, he wrote certain papers.
Okay.
But sometimes I don't know that
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what would have led his calculation to favor baroclinic instability. I would wonder if maybe just differences in the accuracy of the observations or the numerical models, might have led to a difference. What I'm not telling you about today is that we have done an analysis of whether baroclinic instability could be. We actually first began with this, and we found that that couldn't explain their growth. And so that was sort of a null result paper, a null result finding. I'm not telling you about that today because it's not as exciting to give a talk about what didn't work. But we do have observational results that I think strongly indicate that baroclinic instability doesn't explain the growth of these, just due to the vertical tilt of the PD structures in the storms as they amplify. All right, so the third thing that I told you I was going to do was to take that cloud resolving model and now allow it to form clouds. And when we do that, this is an animation of what you see happen. So this is what I told you, we could run the cloud resolving model with some initial condition and just allow the thing to evolve, and you indeed see that a monsoon depression does spin up. And the colors here are meant to give you a radar-like picture of clouds and rain in the model. The contours are the pressure anomaly. The contours are the pressure anomaly at about 3 kilometers altitude, okay? Not the 850 millibar pressure anomaly, which doesn't make sense. But what you see is you see a monsoon depression forming here, spinning up, propagating to the west-northwest, and you even see the peak precipitation on the southwest quadrant of this storm. So here's the peak precip, here's the storm center. Now, that's all well and good, you see this storm forming, but because we did this work with the model without condensation, we can compare the life cycle of the model with precipitation with the life cycle from that dry, no precipitation linear stability analysis. And what I'd like you to see here is that if you compare different days in the life cycles, you can see, this panel right here, compare it with this panel, and so on, this panel with this panel. You can see that the monsoon, this would be your weak monsoon low pressure system, intensifies, moves to the west-northwest, and you see how similar it looks in the cloud resolving model with precipitation to the dry calculation. And so our conclusion was that water phase changes produce only minor differences in the spatial structure, the propagation, the overall characteristics of the storm. They do amplify it, they allow it to kick over that stability threshold. The way that water vapor phase changes allow it to amplify further, recent theory from other groups, actually going back to the year 2001, but kind of revived by Angela Dame's group at the time at University of Michigan. argued that horizontal or north-south advection of humidity could play a key role in monsoon depression amplification. They called this moisture vortex instability. They created a linear system using momentum equations, humidity equations. And their argument was that as you take moist air from northern India and advect it southward, it'll cause the vortex to convect. That'll create a vorticity anomaly, which will help amplify the storm itself. I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but I want to show you with sort of the last part of my mechanistic explorations that to better assess the role of barotropic instability versus those sorts of moist processes, we used idealized simulations to systematically test the sensitivity of these storms to the background state. And I think for looking at the sensitivity of a lot of high resolution phenomena like precipitating storms to variations in climate, doing this sort of test is a great thing to do compared to just looking at global climate models. So we've taken a box, and in that box, three-dimensional box as a function of latitude and height, we imposed an eastward wind, shown here in color shading. So this down here is your low-level monsoon westerlies, strong vertical shear, strong horizontal shear about the monsoon trough, which would be right in the center here. And the contours just show the temperature anomaly relative to the horizontal mean, so that you have warmer air to the north in the Indian monsoon. The equator is cooler than 30 degrees, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to take that idealized box with that idealized basic state, and we're going to assess the sensitivity of depression amplification rate to wind shears and moisture gradients in an ensemble of simulations. So each box here is meant to represent like this would be one simulation, here's another simulation, here's another. And we conducted a simulation, each of which looks something like this. You see in that box we can fit 2 monsoon depressions. They spin up, and they're very idealized looking, right? Because the background state doesn't vary in longitude, and we're allowing them just to spin up and propagate around when something that goes out this side of the box comes back in this other side of the box. And we can vary in this box, we can vary the north-south humidity gradient, the meridional shear, meaning the north-south gradient of zonal wind, and we can vary the vertical shear in the box. When we do that, this is what we find. So we find that as we vary the meridional shear, this is a north-south shear of the wind. This would be our barotropic instability variable. So as we increase this from 0 to 1.5, we're making the background state more barotropically unstable. As we increase this from 0 to 1.5 along this vertical axis, we're making the background humidity gradient stronger. And what you can see is that increasing both the barotropic instability and increasing the meridional moisture gradient makes storms intensify more, because what I'm showing you here in the contours and the colors is the rain rate and the pressure anomaly at 3 kilometers altitude at the time of peak vortex intensity. So right here, you see a strong monsoon depression, and you even see the rain concentrated southwest of the vortex center. Here, there's essentially no amplification. You just have some weak wave-like thing forming, no precipitation. This is some extremely weak vortex, tiny bit of drizzle perhaps near the center. But an important point is that you can increase the humidity gradient as much as you want, and you don't get vortex intensification from that moisture gradient alone. And so that suggests that this proposed moisture vortex instability, it can help amplify monsoon depressions once they've already formed, but you really need the barotropic growth, the barotropic instability to get the vortex to form to begin with. A side point, and I just thought this was kind of cool to me, that the same shears, the horizontally sheared, the vertically sheared background state, that causes the initial amplification, but it is also what prevents monsoon depressions from amplifying further into typhoons. So I'm showing you 3 simulations here from that cloud resolving model. One is with no background winds, so there's no monsoon westerly jet, there's no vertical shear, basically nothing happens. The peak pressure anomaly, remember that in a typhoon, the center has a low pressure, so the more negative these numbers get, the stronger the typhoon gets, right? Or the stronger the low pressure system gets. This is our control run. We have monsoon depression intensification right about here. And if we allow the monsoon depression to grow, but then right at this time point right here, we turn off the basic state in that model, and we can do that because we have the model formulated with those S terms on the right-hand side. If we turn off that basic state, bam, the thing intensifies to some really intense storm that we would call a typhoon. So the sheared basic state is what causes the amplification of monsoon low pressure systems, but it simultaneously prevents them from evolving further into tropical cyclones. We're arguing at different components of the shear that is involved in those 2 different causing and preventing, but the basic state is important in both ways. All right, now the last part of my talk today is going to be how are monsoon depressions changing over time? Can we use any insight that we've gained from maybe more theoretical explorations of these storms to say anything about trends? And you all know very well that India's meteorological department has kept records of monsoon depressions for over a century. And if you look at the year-to-year time series, that's in the black line of the number of these storms per summer. And then you take 11-year running mean of that, plotted as a red line. You can see in this period right here, since the late 1970s, a very large reduction in the number of these storms, from about 7 per summer down to about half that value. So a 50% decline in any phenomenon as a result, perhaps, of something like climate change would be a big story, right? We've even had the first summers in over 100 years of record keeping with no monsoon depressions forming in these years. However, when we were going through and making these composites of the basic state prior to monsoon depression formation, we found in Era 5 data that in one of these summers, this summer right here, I believe, this circle right here, we found a storm that looked very much like a monsoon depression. And when we used the classic pressure and wind speed criterion, we said, hey, it does classify as a monsoon depression. So then we looked at surface scatterometer data, which is not contaminated, if you will, by all the weird stuff that happens in reanalyses, and we found peak wind speeds and even vortical flow, which might be hard to see here in this mess of arrows, but you can in the scatterometer data see even circular flow indicated by this windsat data. So what we did is we said, let's go and actually look at not just Era 5, but let's look at 5 different atmospheric reanalyses and compare those to the 2 hand-analyzed data sets that we have access to, not only IMD's data set, but the data set by Professor Sikka. And what you're seeing here is the number of monsoon depressions and their trend. So it's the trend in the number of storms per summer per year. So a negative trend of 0.1 storms per year, that would be a reduction over 10 years of 1 storm per summer, right? Multiply that by 50 years, that would be 5 storms per summer, right? So that fits. I showed you before that the IOD data set was a decrease of about 3 storms per summer, right? That fits with the magnitude of this bar. None of the reanalyses have that magnitude of a trend, right? That doesn't mean that these are wrong and these are right, but what we did was we said, well, let's look at the time series. So we looked at the time series in the SICA data set and the IND data set, and then in the one data set, the one reanalysis at the time that went before the year 1979. And we said, hey, you know, this doesn't look so much like a smooth trend, but it looks like a sharp drop around this period. And we then did a statistical test, or ran a statistical methodology called the binary change point detection. And that just finds the point in the time series where you can best approximate the time series as a shift between two straight lines, or two constant time series. And that year is shown as a vertical dashed line. And what I'm showing you here as the star is the year at which geostationary satellite data started being incorporated into either the reanalysis, this is the Japanese reanalysis, happened to also have a shift in the year 1980, right when they started incorporating geostationary satellite data. Not much of a large shift, small enough that it doesn't even show up here, although this is only, these trends are since 1979. But this year here, in the early 1980s, was when, at least by the records I found, IMD started incorporating geostationary satellite data into its synoptic analyses. So I don't have a firm conclusion there other than to, I think, suggest that this raises questions about whether changes in our observing network, or perhaps even methods used to classify storms as lows versus depressions, could be leading to some of these apparent large trends in the number of monsoon depressions. And so it seemed reasonable to at least ask, what sort of change do we expect? You know, if we took a global climate model and it simulated monsoon depressions well, if we ran it with increased greenhouse gas concentrations or increased aerosols, would it produce a large reduction in monsoon depression counts? Well, we turned to the high resolution component of the CMIP model ensemble of the IPCC models.